Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what is D&D, I guess. So I've been watching a lot of YouTube lately. I've been a little under the weather. You might hear it in my voice. And I've seen a lot of people talk about various things like, why do we do this? What is this? Or they make a statement like, D&D is this. And I wondered to myself, is that really true? And I'm wondering, like, what is D&D to me? What are these RPGs to me? Is it only one thing? Is it a power fantasy? Is it a war game? Why does it need to be one thing? Why do we play? Maybe we play because we want to recreate stories we've read, maybe a movie we've seen. I know that when I was younger, that was a big thing. We played a lot of Top Secret, which I know is not D&D, but it's an RPG. And I would watch a James Bond movie or a Mission Impossible episode or the Wild Wild West. And then we'd call my friends and be like, oh, let's play a game. And I would kind of create that. Not so much in what you might call a railroady way, right? Maybe a little bit, but the idea is that, oh, Dr. No is doing whatever Dr. No does, or Goldfinger, right? And the players are going to try to figure it out and solve that problem. Same thing, maybe The Hobbit, right? Oh, we're going out to steal some gold from a dragon. And we're trying to create that. Or maybe you want to take on a role of somebody who's not like you. Maybe you want to be somebody who's a computer expert, or super skilled in martial arts, or really charismatic. How do we do that, right? We can do that through a role-playing game. And maybe you want something that's a little bit more exploratory, right? You're going into unknown worlds, delving deep into dungeons. What's there? Solving puzzles and riddles. Well, the thing is, D&D is all of those things. And a lot of these people, when they talk about D&D is this or that or whatever, what they're really talking about is mechanics. And this is kind of what I want to explore a little bit. How can we, or how important is it, let's say, that the mechanics of the game line up with what you're trying to do? Or, in other words, do we need mechanics to do some of the things that we're trying to do? I think for some of us, the answer to that is yes. If we are playing a game where it's all about playing characters that have different skills and different amounts of skill and outwitting the enemy who also has that skill, how do we play it out? If I'm not a computer genius and I'm playing a computer genius trying to outdo another computer genius who's played by the GM who's also not a computer genius, how do we actually do this? This is where mechanics come in, right? You've got skill checks. You have other means of figuring these things out. Can you just role play it? Sure. And if your main function of the game, and when I say role play, I mean just talk it out. If the main function of the game is not that, if that's one scene out of 10 and it's a very minor thing that hardly ever happens, perhaps we don't need a mechanic. We can just play it out, act it out, do whatever makes the most sense. If it's the main part of the game, right? If you're going from room to room using your skills to solve problems, do we need mechanics for this? If the game is playing out stories, heroic stories like James Bond, but we're playing a game that's deadly, let's say, like Top Secret, do we need mechanics in there to allow us to overcome obstacles that we shouldn't be able to overcome? Or do we just let it happen, again, with just the role play, the storytelling? And for a more procedural or strategy type game, what kind of rules do we need for those? Now, I think depending on what edition of D&D you're playing and the exact version, and when I say D&D here, I'm talking about RPGs, so maybe I'll switch to saying that. You may have mechanics for some things and not for others. And I think that one of the goals of many designers, when they're creating retro clones or creating smaller games, indie games, whatever, is to create games that emulate very specific genres, to actually have a why, like to be able to say, this is what it's about. My game is about this. And when you're looking at some of the larger products, the big games like D&D, that's not necessarily the case, right? They want to create a game that generally can do it all. And I think that, well, a noble goal it might be, that might be a very tricky goal, especially if you don't give the GMs, DMs, the ones running the games, enough tools to work with, right? If you give them a lot of tools for one thing and no tools for something else, they're going to have trouble figuring out the something else, maybe, unless you empower them, which is kind of what D&D does. This is why I bounce back and forth on this. If you were to ask me, hey, should we have rules that emulate the genre? I probably would say, if I could only make a yes or no answer, because of course every answer is depends, right? I would probably say, yes, that's going to be useful. But the reality is that you don't always need them. I don't always need them. Maybe you don't. It really depends on your comfort level, your group, what you're actually trying to get at the table. How are you playing this? Is it competitive? Is it going to be a long-running campaign? Are you really a numbers person? You want to really track this and people feel positive about, oh, I gained this, or I got this gold or that experience or whatever? Or is it just what they call beer and pretzels, where you're just kind of having fun with your friends? All of these things are going to make a difference. One thing that I've mentioned before, I think on my podcast, was I think I read the end of the third book of the original 3 Little Brown books of D&D. And I'm not going to read it all again, but basically what they tell you, Gygax Arneson say, if you reach a point in the game where you're not really sure, just make it up. That's what we want you to do. Don't reach out to us and ask us. We don't want to do any more of your imagining for you. And in a sense, does the game company need to do all of your mechanics for you? I think the answer to that, again, is no. I think what we need to do when we're playing a game or running a game specifically is understand the basics of the game so that we can make what they call a ruling, right? In the OSR area, rulings over rules, make a ruling that's consistent with the system and what's going on at the table and what you desire. So let's go back to my 3 little examples I made earlier. Let's talk about mechanics that we could add to our game to make them more like that. So we want to run a James Bond. We want to run a superhero game. Your Captain America, your Conan, right? Your John Carter, your any of these fantastical heroes. And you need to do the impossible. So if we look at like your standard OSR type game, that's probably not going to always happen, right? Sometimes you're going to roll terribly. Sometimes the enemy's going to roll really well. Sometimes you'll make a mistake. In fact, making mistakes and then overcoming them is what makes some of these adventure stories super fun. So you fall into the lava pit and you're dangling by your fingers above it. What do we do here, right? Well, we make a strength roll, let's say. So you roll and you fail, and you fall into the lava and you die. That's not what would happen to James Bond, right? So that's not what we do. We add a mechanic that allows us to overcome those failures a certain number of times, because it's still not going to be fun if you can never fail. So what do? We say, all right, we're going to add a meta mechanic. You have hero points. If you use a hero point, you can reroll maybe, or if you use a hero point, you will survive something that normally would have killed you, and then the story progresses. The failure forward, right? But you got to spend one of these hero points to do it. So you fail your strength check, you fall into the lava, but no, there's a rock right, floating in the lava that you land on, and now you're going down this stream of lava away from where you want to be, but also away from the enemies or whatever. And now you're in a new area that you have to figure out how to get back to where you were to still do the mission. You might still fail the mission, but you didn't die, at least not yet. These mechanics have been around for a long time. The earliest one that I know of is in Top Secret, original Top Secret, which is from 1980, where you had fame and fortune points, and they did exactly this. If something were to kill you, you would use one of those points and it would make it so that you weren't dead. In fact, there was 2 times, fame and fortune. One, you knew how many you had. The other one, you didn't. Only the DM did. So if you tried to use one that you didn't have, your luck ran out. So again, that adds that little edge to it. We don't want to add something where it's like you can never die. You don't want to add something where you can never fail. You just want to give the player character a little bump. That's how we can recreate heroic fiction using the game we're already using, but adding a little to it. Okay, the second one's basically just skills. If you're playing an OSR type game that doesn't have skills in it, you do have ability scores, you do have class and level. You can use these things to mediate what would happen. The expert book, I think it is of the BX set, says there should always be a chance. You can just create on the fly a percentile chance. It also talks about rolling under ability scores. Other things you could do is, let's say the skill system that I talked about a couple weeks back about using the cleric's turn undead as a skill system. You could also just use a 1 in 6 chance, which is pretty common. There's lots of ways to do skill systems, but if you are building skilled characters for your game, if that's the vibe of your game, you want to have something more than that. So here we want to talk a little bit about having a skill system based on building up our characters that we want to create. One system that I think is really great, it's from a game actually called Adventure Fantasy Game, and it is called the 5 More system. Whenever you try a task, you roll 5 or more on a d6 and you succeed. Each time you succeed, you get, I think you start writing out a letter. I think you write a letter out and it eventually forms the word expert. Once you form the word expert, then you get a +1 on those rolls in the future. And I think you then start building a new word. This is a really creative solution, and something like this could work really well. And you could allow people at first level to have, let's say, 3 letters to start put in different skills, or you could do it based on their class. There's lots of different ways to do this. You look at Lamentations of the Flame Princess, they don't have the thief, they've got the specialist and a bunch of skills, and everybody has a 1 in 6 chance to do any of them. And you get X number of points at first level to distribute and X number of points at future levels to distribute. You could just give everybody a flat 1 in 6 chance to do every skill. And then again, as they succeed in them, there's a chance that it goes up. This way, you've still got this character growth thing. You've still got a skill system. It's still challenging. I'm not a huge fan, as I talked about before, of roll under stats, but in a pinch, I would use it. But if I'm building a game around skills, I wouldn't. This is the difference. Okay, finally, procedurals. Now, this is maybe more aimed towards people that aren't playing an OSR type game or an old school game, because old school games, especially something like original Dungeons & Dragons, have tons of procedurals in them. That's what they are. They're procedural games for the most part. Now, if we're playing a game that doesn't have those in there, it's really easy to port them over. I personally have been using Outdoor Survival, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. I have another channel, if you don't know this already, that's Bandits Keep Actual Play. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And I haven't been doing many actual plays up there because I want to switch over to start doing more solo stuff, more kind of experimental stuff. And I've been working on this concept where I use Outdoor Survival, but I've been adding some of the OD&D procedural stuff for like being lost, random monsters, evasion, and I'm adding it into it, creating basically a procedural, almost board game. Well, 100% board game at this point that ties in also to role playing. So I'll talk about that more in the future. But for now, just know that I took a game that had nothing to do, wasn't part of D&D at all, and then added those procedurals to it. It's not hard to do. If you're running 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, you can easily take the evasion rules, you can easily take the hex crawling rules, all that stuff from original D&D, and I'll put a link to where you can get the PDFs on drive-thru if you don't already have them in the description. But basically, you can take all those procedurals literally as they are and insert them. Now, you're going to want to probably modify them slightly based on the character's skills, because that's more or less how 5th edition works. They already have a great skill system built in. So if you're maneuvering through the woods and there's a chance of getting lost, you're probably going to want to have somebody who has a high nature skill or a ranger or something have a better chance of not getting lost. But either way, they already exist. And this kind of comes down to a final point that I'm going to make, which is don't be afraid to take things from other games. Oftentimes people will joke about how OD&D says, okay, well, here's the game, but also buy Outdoor Survival, also buy this game here, also get this here. That's because it's a toolbox, and they understood that. And you should understand that when you're running your games. You can take any game, well, maybe not any game, maybe Monopoly, and you can actually use parts of that in your RPG and create other subsystems, other games that you can play, shift around play, change what is expected, make things new and fun for your players. One thing I want to talk about in another video coming up, not going to now because I haven't used it yet with my players, so I want to be able to give you feedback based on that, is I'm using dungeon geomorphs, but not the way that they're designed. So if you don't know what dungeon geomorphs are, they're basically like squares effectively with dungeons on them, and they're all designed that you can like link them together like a puzzle. But I'm going to use them in a completely different way, I think. Well, definitely a different way than they were created for. Maybe a different way than people usually use them, to create a weird underworld for my player characters. And again, taking something that has one purpose and changing it to suit my world so that I can create effectively my own game. I've talked about this before. D&D should be your version of D&D. And that's what our goal is here, is just to create the most fun for our players at our table. If some other table likes to play a different way and that's not how you like to play, it doesn't matter, right? As long as you're having fun. In any case, I would love to know other game systems that you've used and mixed with D&D, what you play D&D for. What is it? Is it one of those three things that I mentioned? Is there a different reason that you play? Let me know. I would love to talk about it down in the comments below. If you haven't already, you can check the description. You'll find a link to my Discord server. You can join up over there. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to support the channel in that way. In any case, please like and subscribe and do all that other cool YouTube stuff, and I will talk to you soon.